We've been sold a lie that Western civilization is the pinnacle of human progress, reason, and morality. But that's propaganda talking. I spent the first 21 years of my life fully indoctrinated in Christian conservatism, which I now realize is the cultural foundation for the empire that is the United States. Deconstructing Christianity and colonization is a never-ending journey, and yes, they go hand in hand. But we all have to start somewhere because we all have a part to play in building a better, more equitable future. And that's gonna have to start with debunking the idea that we were ever the supreme. Welcome back to the Casey Malone Show. My name is Casey Malone, and I'm so glad you're here. The term Western civilization gets thrown around a lot, like it's some unbroken concept of rationality, democracy, and progress. You've probably seen it in school curriculums, YouTube explainer videos, or more recently in political speeches. This tidy narrative that links ancient Greece to Rome, then to the Enlightenment, and finally to the United States, as though the moral arc of human history just naturally culminated in a Starbucks on every corner and the United States military patrolling half of the globe. But that is not history accurately. That is a narrative that is just marketing, and Western civilization is not a neutral, objective, or even positive concept. It's a kind of branding, carefully constructed to uphold a myth of cultural supremacy. Now, before we get too far into this, Western civilization has traditionally included both the United States and the majority of European countries, though now, under the current United States administration, a lot of European countries are understandably wanting to distance themselves from association with said current administration, and I totally get that. But unfortunately, for the concepts that I'm talking about in this segment, I am going to be using Western civilization to include European countries because we practiced the same colonization, is really what the point is. The narrative we're handed goes like this. Democracy was born in Athens, then went to Rome, then it was preserved through European Christendom, reborn in the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, and finally reaches its full expression in modern Western democracies like the United States. That's exactly what I was taught in the evangelical fundamentalist Christian high school I attended. But this is a carefully edited and intentionally edited story that leaves out most of humanity's contributions and whitewashes the parts of history that don't fit that script, that I.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter Eugene Stories. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing fine. Now, you know very well that for centuries, the Western world has projected itself as the sole custodian of civilization, intelligence, order, and progress through imperialism, colonialism, and transatlantic slave trade. Europe and later America justified global domination by promoting the myth of black people, which were historically primitive, uncultured, incapable of independent governments or innovation. Western education systems, religious doctrines, and academic institutions were used to erase and distort the rich history of African civilization, like Kemet, which we call the ancient Egypt today, Mali, Nubia, the Great Zimbabwe. The myth served not only to uplift the West's image, but to degrade and to delegitimize the global black identity. Well, you watch this video is from this beautiful broadcaster that really talks about this important topic that I really find so much, educative. So really, I want us to watch this video and later on, tell me what you think about this. It is all going to be an educative moment for all of us as we share all this knowledge, because for the longest time, the world was lied to. But I'm glad that people are getting to understand the truth. Parents are making sure that, especially black parents, are making sure that their kids know really the true history. Because honestly, history is important. We have to know where we come from so that we can get to know where we're going. We cannot pretend like we have a clear mind of where we're going without knowing where we came from. And that's where history comes in. History is really important. And I think at some moment we need to take time to appreciate history and those people who advocate those people who teach the true history, and those people who don't allow themselves to be lied to, like these white women who really came out and really relearned the history, because sometimes you need to unlearn, relearn history, because most of the things that you are told were lies. So buckle up for this video. I'll be back and I'll be sharing my commentaries in regards to this. I'll ask for those who are watching us for the first time, please ensure to subscribe to the channel. Join our membership. It's on the button right there. When you just tap on it, it takes you to join, so that you can become a member and envision the growth of this channel. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, with.This. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Let me see you after, where I'll be giving my commentary. Let's watch it.
Idea. This concept of Western civilization frames history as a straight line, linear path from Plato to NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, erasing entire cultures and peoples along the way. Not that I'm a huge fan of everything NATO does, but you get the point. So let's go back to Egypt as an example of ancient history that is kind of just brushed aside because it doesn't really fit into the mainstream Western civilization's historical narrative. Ancient Egypt was much more than what it is usually painted as in most United States public education systems. We are taught that it was just like a civilization of, like there were pyramids, there were pharaohs, that's it. There, this was also the place where the ancient Israelites were slaves in that one story in the Bible. That's it. But the reality is, it was also a hub of very advanced science, mathematics, and medicine. In fact, there's a lot that we still don't know about how advanced, how civilized that society actually was. But what we do know tells us that long before the Greeks, Egyptians had developed concepts of geometry, surgical tools, solar calendars, and in fact, many of the Greek philosophers we revere and hold up today, like Pythagoras and Plato, traveled to Egypt to study. But modern studies in Western civilization rarely mention this, because acknowledging that much of Greek thought was influenced by African civilization kind of complicates the neat little story of European intellectual superiority. And the same goes for the African empires of Mali, Songhai, and Ethiopia. These were sophisticated states with complex systems of governance, education, and trade, and these are just a few of many that I'm naming. Timbuktu, actually, often used as a metaphor for remoteness, was actually one of the most important intellectual centers in the world during the 14th and 15th centuries. It was a central trading post on the Trans-Saharan caravan route. Its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and theology, many written in Arabic, some in indigenous languages. But you don't hear about Mali or Songhai when people talk about the roots of civilization, even though the study of evolution actually traces all of our genetics back to Africa. And all of that is because the word civilization in Western usage has always been kind of racially coded. Indigenous governance systems in the Americas were also, by the way, complex and democratic. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, operated under a more sophisticated model of federalism long before the United States Constitution was written. In fact, some of the founding fathers, including Benjamin Franklin, and I learned this specifically when researching for this segment, openly admired and borrowed ideas from indigenous political structures. But instead of crediting those systems, of course, the United States positioned Native people as savages in need of civilizing. Their knowledge systems, their contributions to political thought, their ecological wisdom, all erased. Western canon wanted nothing to do with it. And that also makes me bring up the East. Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist philosophies go back thousands of years, and they do offer deep insights into consciousness, ethics, and the nature of reality. The Upanishads contain philosophical and metaphysical discourses that rival anything written in the rest, especially the Bible. You've got to be kidding me. Buddhist logic schools develop system of debate and epistemology that mirror Western rationalism. But we weren't really taught that, were we? These traditions shaped entire civilizations, but they rarely appear in world history textbooks in the United States unless they're framed as spiritual or mystical rather than intellectual. And we all know how the West loves to promote rationalism over intuition, and that's worked out so well. Edward Said's foundational work called Orientalism, which I haven't read in full but I know of and read a few summaries for this segment, this work makes it clear. He argues that the West only truly defined itself by inventing its opposite, aka the East. Europe constructed the Orient as exotic, irrational, and inferior, so it could see itself as rational, free, and civilized. And this binary specifically emerged from empire. By the way, empire is quite adept at manufacturing distinctions amongst people and creating divisions so that binaries can exist. So as Europe expanded through colonization, it needed a story or a narrative that justified its domination so that people could consent to this domination. And so it told one that it was the bearer of enlightenment and order in a chaotic, backward world. The myth of Western civilization still lingers today in every conversation that positions the Western world as a beacon of liberty and everyone else is catching up. So when we talk about Western civilization, what we're really talking about is a curated version of history that selectively includes whatever makes Europe and later the United States look like the natural leaders of humanity. It's not that Greek philosophy or the Enlightenment weren't important, it's that they didn't develop in a vacuum. They weren't inevitable. They were deeply interwoven with and often directly borrowed from other cultures that were later dismissed as primitive or underdeveloped. And the worst part of this is the West didn't necessarily just ignore these other knowledge systems or cultures, it actively erased them. Colonizers have burned libraries, okay? Not just military bases, libraries, not to mention hospitals and civilians. Missionaries have intentionally and systematically destroyed temples and sacred texts. Entire languages and oral histories were wiped out in the name of civilization. This was an active intellectual colonization, and it is why colonization has such a stronghold in the minds of all of us to this day. European scholars claimed the mantle of universal knowledge while portraying the rest of the world as its raw material where it gets its inspiration, but not its actual manifestation of intellectualism. And this intellectual theft still shapes our world. It still affects all of us. It affects what's taught in schools, who gets published, whose voices seem as authoritative and whose seem as fringe or extreme. It defines the boundaries of credible philosophy and real science, and it reinforces a worldview in which Western institutions are the default, objective, neutral, advanced, while everyone else is seen as derivative, emotional, or spiritual. When people say the West is more advanced, more rational, or more civilized, they're not stating a fact, they're regurgitating propaganda. Western civilization is not a civilization. It's a story, a narrative, a brand, a story that justifies empire and cultural erasure. And it's time we stop telling it uncritically without really questioning it. Because the real history of human progress is far more global, collaborative, and interconnected than the myth allows. And when we recognize that, we open ourselves up to a far richer understanding of who we are and who we could become. One of the most persistent lies in the myth of Western supremacy is that the West, and particularly Christianity, is somehow responsible for modern scientific advancement. We're taught that without the guiding hand of Christianity, the world would still be in the Dark Ages. But history tells a very different story. The Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, often held up as pinnacles of Western intellectual achievement, did not emerge because of the church. Let's be so fucking for real. They emerged in opposition to it. And much of the foundational knowledge that powered these so-called Western breakthroughs didn't originate in Europe at all. It was inherited, borrowed, or stolen from other civilizations, particularly the Islamic world, South Asia, and East Asia. Let's start with the tension between Christianity and early science, which is still very prominent to this day. Let's remember that the Catholic Church has never been known for nurturing scientific inquiry. It's not out of left field to recognize that it has rather spent a fuck ton of time and energy actively suppressing it. The church maintained a monopoly on knowledge for so long and punished deviation pretty fucking harshly. Scientific progress didn't flourish under Christianity. It had to fight its way through it via visionaries like Galileo and Bruno. Meanwhile, while Europe was slowly crawling out of the intellectual stranglehold of the church, the Islamic world was already thriving in what's now known as the Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly the 8th to the 14th centuries. During this time, Muslim scholars and scientists were building libraries, translating Greek and Persian texts, and producing groundbreaking original work in every field from mathematics to medicine. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a renowned center of learning and innovation. It was a research institute, a translation hub, and it was almost also kind of like a think tank all rolled into one. And this is important because we are constantly getting the message here in the United States about how when you compare the religion of Islam with the religion of Christianity, it's supposedly obvious how backwards and unprogressive and even violent Islam is in comparison with the more modernized, civilized, and even moral faith system of Christianity. But as many of you know, I will never stand for the idea of any patriarchal Abrahamic religion to be better than any other. Just a few hundred years ago, the argument about which religion was more violent, oppressive, and uncivilized would easily have gone to Christianity. But then, Western empires like Britain, France, etc. started systematically using whatever iterations of Christianity suited them to further expand their colonialism and imperialism throughout the rest of the goddamn world. After they spent centuries fighting incredibly bloody internal wars about Catholicism versus Protestantism versus Anglicanism or whatever. As a result, societies that have been non-Christian for a long-ass time are understandably resistant to the idea of a global Christendom. I will never be a supporter of religious fundamentalism or religious authoritarianism or religious extremism of any faith, but to suggest that in the grand scheme of human history, any specific patriarchal Abrahamic religion is any better or worse than one of the others, that's bullshit. They are all so harmful, and frankly, we could do without the lot of them. And that's not to say that everyday practitioners of faith-based systems are inherently violent or unwell. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be the freedom to practice whatever religion you want. Of course there should be. I'm not trying to suggest that good things have never come out of religious environments. But what we're often hearing in the United States, even amongst the atheist community in which I participate, is that somehow Christianity has on the whole been less harmful as Islam and has produced more positive results for the progress of humankind. But this is not true, and it's a narrative that is deliberately intended to indoctrinate us into thinking that other cultures, other religions, other peoples throughout the world deserve our quote-unquote civilizing efforts, through war. But I digress. Let's look at some examples of ways that the progress of human science and achievement has actually been more global in efforts and not so much concentrated within the powers of a few famous white scientists. Consider, and please excuse all of my pronunciations here, Al-Khwarizmi, who gave us the word algorithm. He systematized algebra and wrote foundational texts that introduced Hindu Arabic numerals to the Western world. There's also Ibn al-Haytham, who wrote the Book of Optics, establishing the scientific method centuries before Francis Bacon. He conducted controlled experiments with light and vision, laying the groundwork for modern physics and optics. Then there's Avicenna, who wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text that became standard reading in European medical schools for centuries. He outlined treatments for numerous diseases, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques that were far more advanced than anything happening in Christian Europe at the time. And outside of the Islamic world in China, scholars had already developed the printing press centuries before the Gutenberg press, and I should not have been an adult when I learned that. They invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and seismographs. Chinese astronomers charted comets and eclipses with extraordinary precision. Their civil service exams required a deep understanding of mathematics, ethics, and governance centuries before such ideas caught on in the West. In India, the concept of zero had already been developed by the 5th century CE, a revolutionary idea that underpins all modern computing. No big deal. Indian mathematicians contributed to trigonometry, calculus, and infinite series, which is a thing that I learned one time in calculus. And in the realm of language and logic, Panini's ancient Sanskrit grammar laid the foundations for linguistic theory, arguably making him the world's first formal linguist. All of this knowledge made its way to Europe through trade, contracts, and sometimes peaceful cultural exchange. The Crusades, for all their brutality, did open up contact between the Islamic world and Christendom. European scholars began translating Arabic texts into Latin, often without crediting the original authors. It's through this process that the so-called Western Enlightenment was born. European thinkers stood on the shoulders of global geniuses but rarely acknowledged them. It wasn't a birth of knowledge, it was a conglomeration of it. And once that transfer was complete, Western historians whitewashed the original story to make it look indigenous to their culture. That's not to say Europe made no contributions, but the idea that the West generated science independently from first principles out of sheer brilliance and Christian fucking virtue is laughably false. This matters because it challenges the core of the Western supremacy myth. If science, the prized emblem of Western modernity, wasn't purely Western, then what else have we misunderstood? What other narratives and messages have we been told that we should be questioning? Is there anything that makes us better, actually, than the rest of the world? Is there any core fundamental reason we should be putting America first? When people point to the scientific achievements of the West as evidence of cultural or moral superiority, we have to push back. Because the roots of science are not nation-based, they're not Christian, they're not Western, they are global, they are collaborative, and they are the result of thousands of years of shared human curiosity. The real story of science isn't a linear journey all the way to NASA. It is a vast, messy, multicultural tapestry of ideas, exchanges, and breakthroughs that no one civilization can lay claim as their own. The idea that the West is uniquely rational, democratic, or moral, which is a key one, is one of the most powerful and dangerous myths in modern history. It's the ideological scaffolding that props up everything from foreign intervention to economic exploitation to white supremacy. This belief that Western civilization represents the pinnacle of reasoned and ethical governance does more than just distort history. It enables ongoing violence by disguising it as benevolence. It says things like, we're bringing these other people liberation and civilization. We're told that Western societies are more enlightened, more logical, and more just. But if you actually trace what the West has done with its supposed rationality, let's be real. You'll find a legacy soaked in blood, control, war, colonialism, genocide, and the list goes on. The unfortunate truth that we are not taught in elementary school is that all of this was very much intentional. We are talking about genocidal colonization. European empires didn't just stumble into domination. They didn't manifest it because they happened to be better. They planned it. They mapped, measured, and cataloged the lands they would take and the people they would destroy. The civilizing mission was framed as a rational moral duty or responsibility, but in practice, it meant...
Really, Western civilization worked so hard in making sure that you get not to know the greatness as a black person that you have. And they had their ways of maintaining this. They had their ways of making this happen. And first of it all is, first, they tried to erase and replace what is called black greatness. Part of maintaining the myth, this myth which involved deliberate process of historical theft and replacement. Great African inventions in mathematics, medicine, architecture, and philosophy were either credited to non-Africans or dismissed altogether. Remember, ancient Egypt, despite its demographic and genetic African roots, was whitewashed in the museums. textbooks, movies. Meanwhile, black people were taught that their ancestors were savages rescued by the benevolence of European missionaries and colonizers. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was strategic, designed to destroy black self-worth and ensure perpetual dependency on Western validation and control. They had their own means of making you believe that they are great. And even after exploiting you, they still always wanted you to come back to them because they believed that you could not do without them after erasing your greatness and making you feel like you're not great before. I like to talk about the role of colonial education in spreading lies. One of the most effective tools of this civilization, myth-making, was the colonial education system. In colonized African and African diaspora, students were taught European history, European literature, European ideals while being denied knowledge of their own cultural legacy. Names, language, and customs were Europeanized and indigenous knowledge was mocked or criminalized. Right? This type of indoctrination conditioned generations of black people to internalize inferiority, see the West as the source of all truth, and associate African identity with backwardness and shame. The result was not just historical amnesia, but a psychological captivity, amongst other things that they did to black people. And this led to the rise of Afrocentric scholarship and consciousness movement. Because while in these earliest African universities, like from South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Ghana, the history that was being taught in these classes were Eurocentric. This gave rise to black people, black professors who had an awakening, and they wanted to teach the students the true history, African literature, right, in these schools. And these brought back what people should be learning for, or what at least students should be learning. Today, however, black people across the world are awakening. And a key part of the awakening is the rise of Afrocentric education and scholarship. Pioneers like Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Yosef Ben Buchanan, and contemporary thinkers like Professors James Small, Dr. Omar Johnson, Shahid Bolson, have dedicated their lives to the uncovering of the true history of black civilization. Their work exposes the West built its civilization by stealing, copying, and suppressing the knowledge of African people. Through books, lectures, documentaries, and online platforms, billions of black people are relearning the truths that were stolen from them. And I'm really, really happy, and I'm really, really proud of all black people that are embracing the truth. Black folks that are out there trying to learn, dig into the truth, and avoid all those, what mainstream media says about black people generally, and really learn the truth about what black people should be learning. Let's talk about social media and digital decolonization. Social media has become a revolutionary space for decolonizing knowledge. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram have allowed young black creators, educators, and historians to share ancestral historical truth in real time. The virality of content related to African history, Pan-Africanism, and anti-colonial thought has created a global classroom that bypass Western gatekeeping. Now, a teenager in Kenya, in Jamaica, or in Congo, or Chicago can learn about the Moors' influence on Europe, African contributions to science, and the myth of white saviors, all on their phones. So appreciate the social media on that part in making black people to enlighten some of us to get to know these things. The decentralization access to knowledge is weakening the West monopoly on historical narratives. So I really, really find this really important, right? Let's talk about rejection of Western validation and authority. As more Black people learn the truth, there is a growing rejection of the need for Western approval or validation. The myth of Western civilization as the peak of human achievement is being exposed as a system built on conquest, slavery, and exploitation. Non-alignment. Black intellectuals are no longer asking permission to speak the truth. They are reclaiming their spaces, reasserting their contributions, and creating their own standards of excellence. Right? This shift is especially visible in the arts, fashion, academia, and grassroots organizing, where African aesthetics, philosophies, and traditions are celebrated without apology. Talk about restoration of the image of the African self. The lie of Western superiority was never just about history. It was about identity. When Black children grow up believing their ancestors contributed nothing, they subconsciously internalize limits. But when they learn about the brilliance of Imhotep, the libraries of Timbuktu, the military strategy of Shaka Zulu, or the spiritual complexity of Ifa, it transforms their worldview. The restoration of historical dignity fuels self-respect, mental liberation, and collective pride. It teaches that greatness is not something Black people must aspire by imitating the West. It's something they must reclaim by remembering who they really are. Also going to be talking about the Western civilization's moral exposure. As the West faces increasingly internal contradictions, racism, wealth, inequality, environmental collapse, and geopolitical decline, its image as the model of progress is falling apart. Black thinkers are pointing out that what was once labeled civilization was in fact oppression, marketed as order, colonization, slavery, and imperialism, were crimes against humanity, not signs of superiority. Get it right that even today, Western foreign policies continues to exploit African nations under the banner of development and security. Black people are increasingly recognizing that the West's power came not from moral enlightenment, but from domination. Right? I'm going to be talking about Pan-Africanism and global Black solidarity. This awakening is also fueling resurgency of Pan-Africanism, Pan-African consciousness. Black people from the diaspora, whether in the US, the Caribbean, South Africa, or Europe, are reconnecting with Africa, not through Western narratives, but through shared struggles and ancestral pride. Remember, initiatives focused on repatriations, land reclamation, cultural exchange, and mutual defense are growing. The myth of division, that Black people are fragmented and tribal, is breaking down. In its place is global unity based on historical truth, shared oppression, and vision for collective liberation. A couple of things that really happened. I'll conclude by saying that we have people that talks about these things. They argue that the Western parasitic myth is unsustainable because lies, not matter how deeply rooted, cannot outlast the truth forever. The West built its empire on the suppression of Black greatness, but now that greatness is re-emerging, louder and more unified than ever. Black people are no longer waiting for permission to reclaim their legacy. They are reading, speaking, building, farming, leading, and healing, with their heads high and their spirits firm. The myth of Western civilization is crumbling, and its ruins, a global Blackness renaissance, is rising. I'm your host and presenter, with.This Stories. I'm hoping to see you in my next video. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.